and welcome back. We're in the home stretch, as they say. And as the line from Raising Arizona, when I was asked to moderate this panel, as she said, I think I got the best one. And I do have a great panel here. We're going to talk about gun violence when it's in the news and reporting on it. And I have 4 great panelists. I'm just going to give you a very quick thumbnail before we go into the program. We're going to try and put a quart in a pint container here in the next hour. And I'm going to start with Elinor Tatum, who's the publisher and editor-in-chief of New York's Amsterdam News. She has really been the motivating force behind the newspaper's digital transformation, including a new web newspaper and weekday email letter, Editorially Black. Dr. Jennifer Midberry is an assistant professor at Lehigh University's Journalism and Communications Department. Her research explores how journalism practice can be improved to create more ethical coverage and of marginalized groups and be more effective at evoking audience empathy and engage in important social issues. Aaron Morrison is an award-winning multimedia journalist based in New York City. He's the race and ethnicity news editor for AP, Associated Press. Before that, he was a national writer for AP, the AP race news team, and has covered mass shootings and targeted hate violence in Buffalo, New York, and Jacksonville, Florida. And last but not least, a former colleague of mine at the Chicago Tribune, Jason Grotto, is a senior reporter at Bloomberg News, and he's a specialist in quantitative analysis using databases, statistics, and mapping to root out corruption, negligence, and bad public policy. As he said, he formerly worked at the Chicago Tribune and the Miami Herald. I'm going to start with Elinor to talk about the initiative that you have generated at the news, Beyond the Barrel of the Gun. Could you talk about what is this? What's the, why was it conceived, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. Gun violence is something that has plagued our communities for decades. And, more than a decade ago, the Amsterdam News started calling gun violence a public health crisis in the Black and Brown community. And over a year ago, the Amsterdam News had the opportunity to participate in a philanthropy lab, and we had to come up with a project. And we started discussing what we wanted that project to be. And we were talking about all different things. And we said, you know what, we need to start working on gun violence. We need to figure out how to start reporting on gun violence in a different way. And we came up with Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, combating gun violence in Black and Brown communities. And we said, we want to look at gun violence in a holistic way and try to find solutions. And we realized that there were solutions that are out there that are not being covered or not being funded, and a combination of all of those. And so we said, let's write about the solutions that are out there that are not being talked about. Let's talk about the root causes of gun violence and see if something that we can do that can change the narrative, that can change the dynamic, and that could make a difference in the end game. That let's see if we can make a difference in gun violence. So that's how Beyond the Barrel of the Gun was created, and that was the impetus behind it. And so through that, we have hired several reporters. Through Blacklight, which is our investigative unit, we have brought those reporters in. So we've got science reporters, we've got data reporters, we've got Report for America core members that are working on Beyond the Barrel of the Gun. And we're looking at gun violence in not just it bleeds, it leads way. We're looking at it through science, through health, through the lens of what are the systemic issues of gun violence, and not just there was a shooting, we're going to cover it. But what was behind that shooting, and what was the aftermath of that shooting, and what's happening in the communities afterwards. So we've done several stories. Like, for instance, we just did a story this week, which was our front cover, about why youth carry guns. And that was our front page this week, and that went along with a symposium or a colloquium we had in New York last week, talking about education, housing, and healthcare, and how it relates to gun violence in New York City. In addition, we had our science reporter doing stories on the heat island effect and gun violence. And so the whole initiative in general is to reframe the discussion on gun violence and hopefully make it replicable for other newsrooms across the country to be able to do it as well. And so we're working very hard to just make a difference in the way people look at gun violence. And we're not talking about the gun violence of mass shootings, because we really believe that mass shootings are happening in our communities every day, even when it's one shooting at a time, but on different blocks, because we're seeing that happen all the time. I mean, over the summer, we saw, 15, 20 shootings in a weekend or in a night. And when you looked at the newsstands the next day, it would say, you would see one of the dailies saying, 27 shootings, 14 dead. And then our newspaper had a story about one of the violence interrupters, a gentleman named Beloved, and the documentary that we did on him, and how he's changing the narrative, how he's making a difference in the lives of people, and how he's stopping some of the gun violence in his community. And that's how we're trying to change the story, change the narrative, by showing the stories of the people that are making a difference, and trying to take the celebrity out of the perpetrator and putting it into the people that are making a difference and the people that are left behind. So that's us in a nutshell right now.
Great. Let me just ask you a follow-up question, and maybe it's too early, but my experience is that if you are relentless, you are going to get more results than a shot here. And I don't mean a shot, but I mean a story here, a story there. That a relentless sort of campaign produces more results. I've seen the success of that even back at the Chicago Tribune many years ago. Have you can you measure, or can you talk about any kind of response that you sort of gotten from this so far?
Yeah, well, we're definitely picking up some traction with it. And we are definitely seeing that people are paying attention to the work that we're doing. I've just shared in the chat the section of our website that talks about Beyond the Barrel of the Gun, and then the two stories that I talked about in particular, Driven by Fear, Why Some Brooklyn Youth Carry Guns, and the Heat Island effect. And those stories have been picked up, around the country by other newspapers. You'll see them tweeted out by foundations and others, but the people are watching. People are noticing what we're doing, and they're commenting on it, and they're seeing that, wait, we maybe need to be looking at this. We need to be paying attention. And we're a small newspaper, but they're paying attention to what we're doing, and they're taking notice. Absolutely.
That's great. That's great. I want to shift now to Jennifer, and I believe she's going to start with a video. but I'm really interested in what you're doing, and perhaps you can touch a little bit on what you've done in Philadelphia.
Absolutely. So I'm really happy to be here and on this panel with everybody. So yes, to start off, I'm going to just have you watch a very short video. And as you're watching it, I just want you to think about what the value of the information in that video is. Okay. I'm not hearing any audio.
Another homicide, this one in Hunting Park. A man was shot and killed on the 4200 block of North Fairhill Street. This shooting also happened around 10. Police don't have much info to go on right now still, and they haven't made any arrests.
Okay, so I believe that story was about 15 seconds long. And this is an example of what the majority of reporting on gun violence, at least in Philadelphia local television news, looks like, right? It's typically presented as breaking news in very brief segments with few details. The visuals are usually a crime scene, and the source of information is almost always a police spokesperson. In media studies, news pieces like this one are categorized as something called episodic framing. And that just means that where the story focuses on one event in isolation and does not contextualize that single event within the wider social and structural context. And one more thing to note, that is, in the United States, most US news coverage frames gun violence exclusively as a crime issue. But what I want to propose to you is a series of questions here, right? What exactly does the public gain from the type of reporting we just saw? Is there information in that short clip we watched that will help people keep people safe? Does that story actually enable the public to help solve the crime? Does it give audiences a comprehensive understanding about what causes gun violence and how a city can best stem the tide of that type of an epidemic? I would argue no. But what this type of reporting does do, according to journalism and communication scholars, is it stokes fear in audiences about the neighborhoods that are more disadvantaged. It perpetuates really pernicious racial stereotypes that associate violence with people of color. And it conveys the false notion that there's nothing that we can do to end gun violence. So our team of interdisciplinary researchers that involves the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting and is made up of, myself, Dr. Jessica Beard at Temple University, and a whole slew of other researchers from different institutions. We are delving into how in Philadelphia, how local news has been presenting the issue of gun violence and how that coverage affects the people who are most directly impacted by gun violence in our city. So I'll give you a very brief overview of some of the studies that we've done. We have 4 current studies that have analyzed the content of news itself. And more specifically, we collected every single news story from 3 different time points every day in 2021 from the 4 major Philadelphia local television news networks. And every story that related to gun violence. Out of that, we produced a content analysis, which essentially measured how often the stories in our sample examined potential solutions to the crisis. Our preliminary results indicate that only a very small minority of these news segments gave airtime to ideas to help combat gun violence. And in most of the stories that did address solutions, there's little to no information about the underlying causes that perpetuate gun violence. in a similar qualitative analysis, we really dug in deep and analyzed stories over the summer about gun violence that talked about solutions. And unfortunately, we found that most of those solution stories really only focused on ideas as opposed to really fleshed out plans, or even better, things that were being implemented already to push back against gun violence. And most of the coverage of solutions overall was very, very superficial. The upside, though, was even when there were less than stellar like solution stories, what was a bright spot was that those stories, by and large, centered the voices of people in the communities that were most affected by this, and primarily those were people of color. And so that is something where, you know, in this area, when you're taking a solutions standpoint, it demonstrates that at a very bare minimum, at least it's bringing in the voices that really should be centered in all reporting on gun violence. We also performed a content analysis that looked at how often news stories spoke about gun violence as a public health issue. And just like the way the Amsterdam News has been covering it, President Biden declared gun violence a public health issue in 2021. And in the field of public health itself, they have long considered gun violence a public health issue. But unfortunately, what our content analysis found was that there are just a minority of stories that even touched on a few elements of what we would consider to be a public health approach to this topic. In another study that built on that, we compared the clips that we had, and that's our data set, with police data over a 6-month period. And then we also used a technique called spatial distribution. And all of that pointed to, showed us that the television news outlets were systemically underreporting shootings of adults and single victims, and as underreporting shootings that occur in neighborhoods with lower income and greater amounts of inequality, right? So those are things that media scholars and just people in general who watch the news already sort of know, but this gives us some empirical evidence on that. And I think some of the most important studies we've done are some qualitative studies that look at how the people affected by gun violence perceive and judge the local news reporting in their communities. And the first thing we did was a focus group study where we interviewed community members from Philadelphia. Some were survivors, some had lost loved ones to gun violence, there was even a perpetrator of gun violence who had served time and was now dedicating, you know, his time to fighting this issue. And then just people who lived in communities with high rates of firearm violence. And their lived experience and their personal evaluations really aligned with what a lot of scholars have been saying from a theoretical, critical, cultural perspective, where they critiqued the journalists for only reporting on their communities when bad news happened. And there was never this holistic, complete coverage that depict them as fully functional communities, right? It was just this emphasis on the negative, which gives the impression that those neighborhoods, primarily neighborhoods of color, of people of color, were inherently continuously violent. They were really upset that news presented people of color in dehumanizing and stereotypical ways that implied that victims are guilty of some type of crime, that the lives of Black and brown people are disposable. And they contrasted that with coverage of white victims that was more in-depth and very sympathetic. They asserted that news about gun violence in their communities and neighborhoods wasn't useful to them at all, but really seemed to be voyeuristic entertainment for white suburban audiences. And they wanted stories that included solutions to gun violence and resources for people who are affected by gun violence. And then our second project, we interviewed 26 patients of my colleague, Dr. Jessica Beard, who were recovering from recent firearm injuries. We wanted to see whether having their stories included in local news or not included affected them during such a vulnerable time. What we found was that most of the participants whose stories were in the news characterized that experience as primarily a negative one. And the patients, except for one patient whose stories were not in the news, they expressed a deep sense of relief that their stories weren't in the news. So for those people whose stories were in the news, we found several themes. The first was that they also described the coverage as very dehumanizing. It lacked any of their perspective and input, and they felt that it was exploitative of their pain. Some patients were re-traumatized when they did engage with the news coverage about them, and other patients avoided and hadn't watched or read or engaged with any news coverage for fear of being re-traumatized. A lot of patients said that there were inaccuracies in the news stories and found those errors to be very upsetting. Several patients felt unsafe after realizing that news stories had published details that they felt could potentially lead the perpetrators to them where they were hospitalized and vulnerable. And most patients thought the stories were stigmatizing of them and their reputations. And patients gave numerous examples of how the news coverage really contributed to fear within their own communities and perpetuated the cycle of violence. So, what can be done about this? How could it be done differently in a way that is more useful to the public and that is less harmful to the people who are already suffering from this epidemic? I'll offer a few big picture ideas that essentially can be summarized up as saying, do the things that Elinor and her team are already doing at the Amsterdam News, right? So kind of going back to that opening video, I think the biggest thing journalists need to do is really look at what the actual news value is of the type of coverage that we do that is predominantly being produced, right? And in doing that, a crucial part of that is to ask the question, whether covering gun violence as a crime issue really the best frame, right? And so my colleagues and I agree with Elinor that the best frame for this is a public health frame, right? It's more accurate and it's more useful to society. So think of the shift we saw recently in the way that drug use and and substance use addiction has been characterized, right? If you contrast the way that in the 80s, the way that the crack epidemic was covered, it was the blame was all on the people who had substance use issues. But in the opioid epidemic, we saw that this shift was covering now drug use as a public health issue. That allowed journalists to look at the structural factors involved and to really spark a national discourse about how to support people who have substance use disorder and to find ways to prevent the crisis from escalating. And then the other thing is I think journalists can approach this issue by not just reporting on the problem, but also by highlighting the solutions. What are people doing on the ground to prevent this? What could be done, right? It gives audiences a more complete picture of the issue. And this type of solutions journalism also increases audience optimism. And then finally, I think the most important thing, and if we do this, all of the rest of these things will follow, we really need to prioritize centering the narratives of the survivors of gun violence themselves, right? They are the real experts on this topic. They're more of experts on this topic than the police, than scholars, than anyone, right? And if we are advocating for news organizations to seek out the perspectives of survivors and for people who are co-victims who've been affected by this, and to do that in terms of follow-up stories. If we, after survivors have gotten a chance to recover and think through and process all of their trauma, if there were stories that allowed them to talk about how they were affected and to talk about their recovery, And they can also share their ideas that they've thought a lot about ways to prevent gun violence, right? And in this way, journalists can place survivors' individual experience in the context of systemic issues. And my colleagues and I really think that this type of coverage would have more value for the public and would also just be a more ethical way to treat the people who are really bearing the burden of gun violence. Thank you.
Thank you. And that really segues nicely to Aaron, in terms of, you know, you both talked about voice, and you've been, you know, boots on the ground. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, this must feel to some degree, Jennifer, like trying to turn the Queen Mary, when you're trying to introduce a change or a shift in the way coverage occurs. And can you talk a little bit about that, Aaron?
Absolutely, because I think one of the things that I typically try to remind myself when I'm covering these stories is that it's never just the gun violence that we need to be covering, and the massive bodies that are left in the wake. That these events are connected to just about every coverage area that you can think of. And so I think if we took a more holistic approach to making those connections and connecting those dots, then people would understand that it's a much larger problem, more all-encompassing problem than they actually realize. And I'll give some examples. After the shooter in the massacre at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, killed 9 people. I had the idea at a previous outlet that I worked for to attend the entire trial and mine the shooter's life, the testimony, the evidence for clues about what actually led to that person's decision to pick up a gun or guns and go into a sacred space like a Bible study at a historic Black church and commit such an atrocious act of violence. I think it's important for us to not forget that hate violence involving guns is gun violence. And I think sometimes we treat them as though like just the gun violence we really need to be focusing on is the stuff that's happening in Chicago and, some of these other larger cities, whereas these still rare but horrific acts of violence like that in Charleston, like in Buffalo, New York, at the supermarket there in the Black community, like the one recently at the Dollar General store in Jacksonville, Florida, those all involved shooters, perpetrators with hate motivations. So I see that thread in our journalism as part of coverage of gun violence. And I don't think it should be viewed as separate from the other types of gun violence that we typically hear about, as Jennifer pointed out on the evening news. In the Buffalo example specifically, I think it's important for people to see the scale of the devastation, particularly on Black America, when you think about these type of motivated gun violence incidents, events. I have not been able to entirely verify this as true, so I'll just preface it with that. But I do believe that the Buffalo supermarket shooting is the worst anti-Black mass shooting carried out by a white lone wolf gunman in history. But when you see the coverage of this, that often doesn't really bubble up to the surface. We're not taking stock of these violent incidences in this way. We're typically just like covering the, like how many victims, and we're going to the door knocking on the victims' families, and we want to tell those stories. And that's right, we should be telling those stories. But I think it's also important that as these things keep happening, we take stock and note to the public when this stuff is getting worse, when the casualties are growing as a result of the use of guns in these crimes. So, I wanted to point that out, that, while we are looking for solutions, let us also properly describe and categorize the things that are happening in this community so that we can see when things are growing worse and not just see them as just yet another story that we have to cover. Last thing I will say is that the gun violence is also an issue of our education system. And it's not what you think I mean. I don't mean school shootings. I mean the attempts to suppress history and the history of race in America. That ultimately endangers the lives of Black Americans and others who are typically targeted in communities across the US. If you look at the shooters, particularly in the Charleston church shooting, the Buffalo supermarket shooting, and there's evidence of that in the Dollar General shooting in Jacksonville, Florida, all of the shooters believed things about Black Americans that were completely false, or ideas of white supremacy, that a good old-fashioned education that was accurate and true and compassionate and didn't erase the experiences of Black Americans in this country, an education could fix that. But right now we're seeing across the country attempts to suppress that history, which, I can't see where we can't have the expectation, or shouldn't have the expectation, that there are more young people who are coming out of our public school systems not understanding the history of the Black Americans, of indigenous folks, of Asian Americans, and then developing ideas about those people as justification for the gun violence that they exact on those communities. So, in the ways that we, again, are trying to cover gun violence and do better about the journalism around gun violence, let's not forget, hate violence that is, that involves guns as part of that narrative, as part of the story that deserves coverage, and that we see, that all of our coverage areas really can play a part. All of our beats really can play a part in looking at and examining gun violence in a much more holistic way.
And what I'm hearing from all three of you so far, one of the messages is slow down. It isn't just take a swipe at something and then move on to the next thing, which is, that's the deadline pressure is always going to be there, but there is, I think, overemphasis, this is my opinion anyway, on some of that, because going to the example from the film clip that Rebecca showed, what is the value of that, beyond that you had some footage, and my guess is that unless it was something that I can think of an example, but it's going to disappear, and so you're saying sitting through an entire trial to pick up clues, and that's patience, and that's devoted time and resources devoted, and that, I think, is something that is not always a commodity anymore in the news media, but I think we need to fight for it, and the proof is right there, and I'm going to segue right from that to Jason, because your story, and I commend everyone, I want you to talk about it, but I commend everyone to read this story. Small gun makers find state weapons bans offer a lucrative niche. I had not seen a story like this before, and I find it's something that you really flushed out and fleshed out, and I find it to be actually kind of scary, because it seems as if nothing we can do, because everything that's passed, they're a step ahead.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate being part of this conversation. I think it's an important one. I work right now at a business publication, Bloomberg News. Our owner is very involved, as you know, he was former mayor of New York, and has since then has been very involved in funding gun control measures around the country. That created its own issues as we delved into this corner of the world. But you know, there were a spate of shootings, as we've discussed, mass shootings. So Buffalo, Valde, and then Highland Park outside of here in Chicago. And it really, you know, what that spate of shootings did was really highlight the fact that gun violence is really touching all corners of the country. It's certainly a bigger problem in some communities than in others, but it gave us an opportunity, or at least me an opportunity, to do something that I've really been wanting to do for a long time, and that is to investigate gun manufacturers. The way that I've seen it is sort of they sit up at the top of a food chain and they make a hell of a lot of money. Private equity firms have been more and more acquiring gun companies. And so I was able to kind of put together a pitch and get my editors to buy into looking into the business of guns. From the manufacturer's perspective, there's a lot of coverage on dealers and not so much on manufacturers. It's a very difficult puzzle to work out. So one of the first things we did was to look at, and by the way, I put a link in the chat to our one story that we did. One of the first things we did is to start to look at the very little amount of data that's available from the ATF. So the first thing was to look at licensing data from the ATF and look at that over time. And something right away popped out at us, and that was there has been a huge uptick in the number of firearm manufacturers in the United States. There is now 18,000 licensed manufacturers of firearms in the United States. I think it's grown 4x over the last 10 years or so. And meanwhile, the number of dealers have been falling. The reason for this is the ATF regulations allow gun manufacturers to also be dealers. And so a lot of dealers have been leveraging new technology that has gotten a lot cheaper. And I'll talk about that in a second, to start just basically literally in the back of their shop to start building guns. There's a couple of issues that if anyone's ever gets into this, I'm happy to talk about, like some of the technical stuff. Feel free to reach out. But what we did is we looked at the manufacturers. The ATF puts out another report called the Annual Firearms Manufacturing Report, which lists the type of guns and the number of guns that each manufacturer makes. And this took a lot of work because, of course, the ATF doesn't compile their data in a way that's very user-friendly. So we spent many weeks standardizing the data and putting it together so that we could kind of see this, what are these guys doing? What are these new manufacturers doing? And we found some really interesting things. We found that, first of all, the license to manufacture guns is $50 cheaper than it is to be a dealer. We found that these new technologies, specifically something called the CNC machine, which is a computerized routing machine, the price of those has fallen dramatically. We also found that the crackdown in traditional advertising has allowed gun manufacturers to really do guerrilla marketing, particularly online, and some of it's incredibly scary, to push their wares on people. And then we also found what is perhaps the most compelling and scary thing, which is some state restrictions have actually opened up niche markets for a lot of these guys. So we ended up basing our story on a company called Dark Storm, which was located in Long Island. And Dark Storm's entire business model was, hey, do you live in a communist state where you can't have an assault rifle? We have an AR-15 for you. And they essentially went into these laws in California, DC, all of the states, Illinois now, with restrictions. And when they restrict guns, they have to provide definitions, legal definitions as to what is an assault rifle. And what they do is they find the loopholes and they remake the guns in ways that get around those. So Dark Storm, for example, you'll see in the story if you check it out, they did one screw to fix the magazine that would go inside an AR-15. And that made it, as long as they didn't have a muzzle suppressor, legal in many, many states. And then they found other ways to get around the fact that, on a certain level, that makes sense. If it's a fixed magazine, you can't reload very quickly, but they found a technological solution to that. And that is an auto loader that goes in through where the bullet or the casing exits after you fire a weapon, where you can reload right away, like literally within a second. And they push all this stuff. And I was looking at their videos, and one of the things I noticed is one of the guys had a Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 1%. So these were like 3%er guys. I don't know if you're aware of that. They're sort of 3% of, anyway, you can look it up. It's not great stuff. So we went and talked to these guys. And what was interesting is they were originally going to start a organic cosmetics company. They were basically business guys. And they kind of got into guns. And then they started to realize that the gun market was shifting in the US to a do-it-yourself, build it yourself, customize it yourself market all around the AR-15, which is a component-based firearm. And what they started to do is they got their first CNC machine. They actually got into a partnership with 3 other dealers and had a CNC machine in Las Vegas. And they started making little parts for an AR-15. One of them was a buffer weight. So a buffer weight, one of the things that makes an AR-15 so deadly is that it doesn't have the kickback. So even if you're not a trained shooter, you're so much more deadly accurate with an AR-15. One reason is the buffer weight. It's on a spring and it's attached to the receiver and goes into the stock, which is where you put your shoulder, and it absorbs the shot. So Dark Storm actually makes most of its money off of buffer weights. But they also started making what are called lower receivers, or frames, which are the part of the gun that houses the firing pin, the trigger mechanism, all of that. Turns out that is the only regulated part of a gun in the United States. Barrels, grips, everything else, no regulation at all. The ATF doesn't look at it. It's only the receiver. And there has been a massive explosion among firearm manufacturers to just make the lower receivers. That has bled into something called, and many of you have probably heard of this, the 80% receiver, which is a lower receiver, but that is only 80% what's called milled out. In other words, all the little pieces are not cut out. That's a whole new explosion leading to this ghost gun phenomenon that I'm sure many of you have heard about. And so, we went and talked to these guys at Dark Storm, and they were just very adamant that, like, this is our right. We've made all this. They were booming. They went from making like 150 guns to 25,000 a year. They ended up getting they were getting sick of New York and the legislature there. So they met with Matt Gaetz and were able to get from Ron DeSantis huge subsidies to move down to Florida. And they are now going from a small shop on Long Island. They're building a 25,000 square foot manufacturing facility in Florida. As they put it, they're leaving the communist state to move into the free state, and so that they can, build more of these guns. Why does this matter in terms of, covering gun violence in America? One of the things we found is Dark Storm had been in business for 10 years, and the ATF had never once gone to their manufacturing facility in Long Island. When we went to visit, they actually let us come in, and there were guns everywhere. The back door was like a garage door, wide open. You may have seen there's some really great reports that the ATF has finally started to study the firearms market. More than 80,000 firearms have gone missing over the last, I can't remember the exact statistics, so I don't want to quote it, but a lot of guns go missing. And those are just when they actually inspect and find that the guns are missing. We were able to track, so we were really looking at these small guys. The Attorney General in Philadelphia thumbed his nose at the ATF's new rule. It's actually a federal rule called the T. Hart Amendment. Many of you might have heard of it. It blocks the public disclosure of something called tracing data. So journalists used to use this data a lot under the Clinton administration, and basically what it does, if there's a gun involved in a gun crime, and I failed to make the caveat to Elinor's point earlier on that most shootings are not mass shootings. That's number one. And number two, most shootings are done by pistols, not AR-15s. That is changing a little bit. But the AR-15s are just incredibly dangerous. So I just want to make those caveats right away. Should have done that earlier. But the tracing data allows, if your gun is found, your crime gun is confiscated in a crime scene, what the ATF is supposed to do is trace it back to its origin, to the manufacturer, to the dealer, or whomever, and where it went from there. We, as journalists, used to use that data a lot to try to get underneath crime in some of the ways that have been outlined here previously. But under the Bush administration, the George W., they cut off that data. One reason was because people started suing the gun manufacturers. There were big cases in Illinois and other places around the country. And so they got the administration, we are now no longer able to access tracing data. However, as I said, the Attorney General in Pennsylvania thumbed his nose at the ATF and released the tracing data. And we ended up grabbing that and looking, because we have this kind of unique data set where we know how many guns, we stratified the manufacturers. What we found is small gun dealers are showing up disproportionately in crimes than the big guys. So when you see some of the tracing data, you see Smith & Wesson, Colt, they're at the top, but they make millions of guns. So as a rate of guns that are out in circulation, Colt, the big guys, they're actually low, they're falling, and they're losing market share to these small guys, and those guns are showing up more in crimes. I think it was the Uvalde shooter used a gun from Daniel Defense. I had never heard of Daniel Defense until then. They are like a dark storm where they start out very small and they've grown really, really big. So these are some of the things we dug into. We have since then, this year, have expanded to look at the exporting of U.S. manufactured firearms. And we have a bunch of stories. I'll put one of them out here. My computer is.
I'm gonna ask you to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, so that's it. We started looking at the fact that there was a rule change under the Trump administration that made it easier to export guns, and now these semi-automatic pistols and rifles are going all over the world. And there's mass shootings in Thailand, violence in Guatemala and Brazil, and so that's an ongoing series we're working on now.
18,000 of these
Thanks so much.
dealers. It seems like
1,000 of these,
almost one in every backyard.
It seems like
a media outlet in the
almost
country.
one in every.
So I do think there are some questions that I think Rebecca's going to help me with.
Yes, so thank you so much for everybody who has been submitting questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but there are a couple that I wanted to uplift first because I think that all of you can speak to them. And so Sadie has a question / comment, and she says that your suggestions for local broadcast news channels seem difficult to an individual journalist to implement, due largely to their corporate structures, funding models, and the broadcast format. Could you clarify some suggestions specific to journalists operating within these spaces that may not have the last word to direct coverage in that way?
So I can jump in since it seemed like it was related to the broadcast portion of it. So I think, so that's an excellent question. And so I just really, for time purposes, put out some big picture ideas, but there are things that you can do as an individual journalist that are easier to implement independently, right? So the first thing is you can find sources that are different than the police. It takes more effort, right? The police are usually on there on the ground at the crime scene, but you can reach out to someone in Parks and Recreation and find out how they are thinking about the work they do for, younger folks. You can reach out to public health officials. You can reach out to community leaders. You can reach out to the pastors, block captains. In addition, because obviously sometimes the family and, maybe is too traumatized and unavailable. But if you think about it, there are all sorts of options that you can go and get voices that are not just the police, right? So that is within your control to some extent, right? Who do you go to? You can pitch follow-up stories. You can pitch a solutions-oriented story. You can just sneakily, kind of have a tag, add a solutions component to that breaking news part. But in order to do those things, you really have to develop relationships in the community that you can access at these times. And a way to do that is to find those communities that are most affected and pitch feature stories that never get told in these communities, right? And that will, but you have to develop the relationship. And then you can kind of bring all these factors into it. And so that is something that is investment of your time that I think is just important anyway.
Yeah, I think that's what Aaron was touching on, was an investment of time and being patient and
just on that point, can I also add to what Jennifer's saying? I'm currently in the Pointer Institute is doing a training. It's a weeks-long, months-long training with newsrooms across the country, including local broadcast news channels, where they are trying to shift the way we think about our crime coverage, not just in print, but also in broadcast television news. So that's something that you can suggest to your newsroom, to managers at your newsroom, to say, hey, let's not be left behind the times when it's coming to shifting the way in which we cover crime, the way in which we cover shootings in our local community, because there is a movement out there, I can tell you, to really be different. I'll just put it like that, to be different about how we go about covering shootings. So that's just a quick suggestion I have.
Well, and
Yeah,
I think
and I'd like to. You have to fight for it. You have to fight if you want to see the coverage in your newsroom change. You have to fight for that, and you've got to show them the reasons why it can look different, and you have to show them the reasons, and you have to show them how it can look different. So you bring examples, whether it's the studies that Jennifer and her folks have done. You've got to bring something to them to say it can look different and it can work, because people don't necessarily want to see what you're showing and what value does it bring. What value does, like the clip that Jennifer showed us, what value does that bring to anyone? What information does it give? How does it enrich people? How does it help people? It doesn't. It just puts fear in people, right? But it doesn't give them any information that's going to help them go on with their lives. It doesn't tell them what they necessarily need to be afraid of, if anything, because we have no idea what the motive was behind that particular shooting, right? We have absolutely no information, nothing to go on. So what was the point of it? It was pointless, right? You've got to figure out how you're going to create your coverage that is going to make sense. And so, just taking that argument to the newsroom leaders and saying, okay, why are we doing it? Let's take a look at this again, and let's try to make a decision. And so we did that. Though we're not broadcast, we're print. we made a decision, and we said, what are we doing here with our coverage? And let's change the way we are covering these things, because we are part of the problem. We need to be part of the solution. And that's what we decided to do.
I want to just ask one last question that Elliot offered that I think would be a great kind of round robin to close us out. And Elliot says, considering how much work it requires to cover one single homicide thoughtfully and carefully, what advice would you give local publications who historically have acted as the papers of record and therefore feel compelled to cover everything as it happens, but are short-staffed compared to the issue of gun violence and can't give each incident the time and consideration they deserve?
I can just jump in and quickly say that, as someone who covers, my team is created to cover race and ethnicity in this country. And often a big part of that is the coverage of police brutality in the US. But there's no way I could possibly cover every single police shooting that happens in America. Police kill 3 people every single day in America. I'm not going to cover all of those stories. I can't. What I can do is be really, sensitive about connecting the dots. Again, I said that earlier, connecting the dots, talking about trends, helping people to understand the scope of the problem rather than just the isolated, events.
We have to be intentional in our coverage, and it may not be covering every single one. And yes, you may be the newspaper of record in your area, but being the newspaper of record, you've got to give an overall picture of what's happening in your community. And as Aaron so rightly said, you've got to connect the dots, because if you don't connect the dots, you're not giving a full picture. So if you're saying there was a shooting today and there was a shooting 2 days ago and there was a shooting, 3 days before that, you're not talking about the pattern. You're just talking about the problem. And you've really got to look at it in a more holistic approach. And maybe instead of having that person going out every day and covering something piecemeal, using them to cover something more holistically, and having a real discussion with their newsroom as to how you want to cover gun violence is the start.
I think the Dark Storm example is great in the sense that, you took one manufacturer and told that story, but told a much broader story. And I think that you didn't write a story about every one of the 18,000 manufacturers, but you told a story. And I think that's what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I would just add, I wouldn't go to the editors right away. I would furtively maybe on some time off, or when you have a little time during the day, slowly chip away at something that you really feel like is great and build it into something, then pitch it, then make these arguments when you got some goods.
Jennifer, any last words before we have to wrap up the session?
30 seconds.
Sure. I would just say use the metric of news value. What is going to really inform your audience the most? A series of breaking news stories with very little information, or stories that really delve into the issue and show people the underlying causes and ways to prevent the gun violence from continuing, right? What's the news value? What's the value to your public?
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists for their time and all the work that they're doing. I think it's just incredible work, and it restores my faith. Sometimes I have my down days on the state of the media, but seeing and hearing from you really restores my faith in it. Thank you very much. This is the final session for the public. There's going to be one more session for journalists only and fellows, and I've been asked to rename yourselves by your publication if you're joining us. But it's many thanks to you all. I appreciate it.
We will be taking a 10-minute break and then inviting all the journalists and fellows and any of our speakers to participate in our roundtable.